Welcome to the Filmlinks podcast.
We analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 51, The HITCH-HIKE, The Wrong Men.
Yeah, and welcome to season 2, everybody.
Welcome to 2018, season 2. We've made it through a whole year of podcasts, and we are not stopping.
No, we're back for another round, and we're kicking it off with one of the all-time great directors, and certainly one of the all-time best to study directors for those of you interested in filmmaking or just in the art of filmmaking in general, Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah, we only spoke about one Alfred Hitchcock film during the entirety of season 1, and at some point that became intentional because we realized that he deserves a deep dive, and that's what we're doing. We have 5 episodes going through Alfred Hitchcock's films thematically, and we're actually going to be kind of structuring these episodes after a book called Hitchcock Piece by Piece, which we both have. It's a really cool look at Hitchcock's work with little like inserts, memorandums, and storyboards and stuff like that you can pull out of envelopes within the book. It's by Laurent Bozero. I'm probably saying that very wrong. But anyway, I'll include a link to that in the notes. But this book structures his films this kind of in this thematic manner. And we thought that was a really cool way to look at Hitchcock's films because he does have these things that he tackles over and over and over again. So this week we are starting off with this idea of the wrong man. But before we do that, let's talk about the man himself, Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. So Alfred Hitchcock is probably the most famous British filmmaker of all time. He was born in England in 1899, and originally he wanted to be an engineer. Like so many of the early filmmakers, they started off wanting to do something else and then got into filmmaking, and typically it was engineering. I don't know if that was just a side effect of the times or it was because filmmaking just needed somebody who had the technical expertise at that point in time. But he eventually signed up as a intertitle designer at a burgeoning studio. He did some work as a production designer in the German silent film era before coming back to England to become a director. And his first success was with The Lodger, which is the first film we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and it was actually interesting because the studio that he was working with, there was a little bit of a professional rivalry with one of the directors that he came in under, but it quickly was noted that he was better than his mentor director, and his mentor had a little bit of a grudge about that, so he shelved the project and badmouthed it a little bit until it was eventually seen and was very well regarded. So while in Britain, he created several other films that still have a long-lasting impact. One that we're going to talk about today, The 39 Steps, as well as The Lady Vanishes. And while he was in Britain, he married Alma Relville, who they were married for the rest of their lives. And she was a huge supporter of his work and actually met in the industry. So she knows the world, she knows film, and they had a great partnership for their whole lives.
Yeah, both personal and professional for a very long time, which is a rare thing in the industry. You see a lot of these big personalities go through a lot of divorces and affairs and all this stuff, and they just stuck together for a really long time, which is impressive in and of itself. But we are the Filmlinks, not the relationship links. So moving on, Alfred Hitchcock moved to America in about 1939, where he started working with the famous producer David O. Selznick of The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind fame. And he continued making films. His peak years are probably somewhere between 1954 and 1964. That's where the best of his best stuff has come out or was made. And he even did a TV show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was an anthology. It feels a lot like The Twilight Zone. Alfred Hitchcock introduces
without
each
the
episode.
sci-fi stuff. Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock introduces each episode, and then you see the episode, and it's got all this tension filled into it. Each one's like a mini attempt at making an Alfred Hitchcock film, which is fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and they're very good, and they have quite a bit of tension, as you would expect from the master of suspense. But after 1964, there was a little bit of a slump in his popularity with The Birds and Marnie, which were not very well received when they first came out, which are now regarded critically very well. And then Frenzy came out, which did a little bit better. And his final film was Family Plot before he died in 1980.
Yeah, he definitely slowed down there at the end, which I don't know if I can blame him for him. He was still very prolific. He made somewhere over 50 films.
And even his bad films, like some directors would kill to make a film as good as Hitchcock's bad films.
Yeah, the ones that are somewhat misfires, or some of the ones that are a little offbeat or off color as he got towards the end of his career. He's got a very dark sense of humor that works well for the stories he likes to tell, and sometimes it goes a little too far for people. I think like in Frenzy, for example, which is one of his later films. I think it's his second to last film. But it's hard to beat Hitchcock at his prime. The best of his filmmaking are all masterclasses in how to make a film. And he was meticulous too. He would basically have the film edited before he shot it. He would storyboard it down to a T. He had it all ready to go. And then it was just a matter of shooting it. So
there's a quote from when he was working on Strangers on a Train, where one of the actors saw that he was kind of looking down and glum, and they're like, "Hey, what's up, Hitch? What's the matter?" He's like, "I'm bored. I've already done everything. I just have to tell you what to do and where to point the camera, and that's it. I've already got it all done."
Yeah, see, exactly. So if you're looking for somebody to study who knows how to make a film, not only well, but also efficiently, Hitchcock is your guy. And you can see it if you watch the editing in the film, which is pretty much done by Hitchcock himself since he plans it all out. It looks very well planned. It's just conducted very well. And that's what you're looking for if you're looking for a director to study. So Hitchcock's your guy there. But what films are we talking about specifically today, Jonathan?
So we're starting off with his breakout film, The Lodger, from 1927, and then moving on to The 39 Steps, still in Britain, from 1935, and ending with one that most people will be familiar with, North by Northwest, with Cary Grant, from 1959, which was nominated for Best Writing, Editing, and Art Direction at the Oscars.
Right. And there are, again, our through line for today, our through line for this week is The Wrong Man. This is the archetype we're going to be looking at today. It's something that Hitchcock is fascinated with and is pretty much the plot in almost all of his movies. Not all of them, but almost all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and he has this quote that kind of sums up his idea of this, where he says, "My heroes are the average men to whom bizarre things happen, rather than vice versa." So he was definitely more interested in, taking himself and putting himself in this situation that's totally insane, and thinking, how would I react to this? How would a normal person react to this? Rather than films that you can imagine he'd be thinking of where it's just, we're going to focus on this really weird character but not really give them anything to do. So that's what we're looking at, is the average man put in a situation that hopefully none of us will ever be put into, but we can speculate, what would we do? Yeah.
And I'm not saying follow the example of Hitchcock movies in that situation. A lot of the lead characters do kind of dumb things, but they are fascinating examples if you like to think about that kind of stuff. Think about murder mysteries. If that's your jam, this is your jam. So on to the films. And before we start explaining them to you guys, or analyzing them, or however you really want to consider it, as you know, we like to kind of go over what the plot of each of the films is, just so you kind of have an idea of what we're talking about, even if you haven't seen it. And we're just going to throw up a spoiler warning now, because the theme of this week is The Wrong Man. So you kind of know that these guys are innocent going into it. None of these lead characters, none of these protagonists did what they're accused of having done. And eventually at the end, they will be vindicated, because we haven't hit the 60s yet. So they're going to be vindicated in some way. And in both the 39 Steps and North by Northwest, you know they're innocent from the beginning. You just know it because you see the character and you get to know the character before they're accused. But with The Lodger, that's not really the case. It was his first wrong man plot that he ever did. It was the second movie he ever did that he directed. So it doesn't have you don't know that our lead character isn't the murderer until the end, but it's almost impossible to find this movie and want to watch this movie without kind of knowing what it's already about. Like if you're interested in Alfred Hitchcock and you hear about The Lodger, you hear about it as the first wrong man plot he did, or that one about the guy who isn't really the killer. And if you know anything about Alfred Hitchcock, you know he didn't do it. Like that's how Alfred Hitchcock movies work. So just a little forewarning there. I would highly recommend watching these before you listen to the rest of the podcast. But just know that these guys are innocent before we start explaining these plots. Anyway, Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah, so The Lodger from 1927 kind of pulls from the Jack the Ripper kind of a deal where we start off knowing we're in London and we know that there is a killer. He calls himself the Avenger. He leaves a little note with a triangle and the word the Avenger in it on his victims. He's going around killing blondes in London. And so then we kind of zoom in to our main characters at this little bed and breakfast kind of a thing. And we have this woman who and her boyfriend who is a cop, and he's super excited. He's going to find the Avenger and he's going to save the day and all this stuff. And then comes the Lodger. This new guy comes in and rents a room and takes down all of the pictures of the blondes in the room that he's staying in because they make him uneasy. And he's wearing a scarf like all the newspapers say that the Avenger does. And
he acts creepy as hell.
Yeah, he is also very creepy. Like he could be a vampire if this was in Germany.
Yeah, his entrance reminds me directly of Nosferatu.
Yeah, it's a lot of fog behind him, which is really cool. And also the subtitle of the movie, The Lodger, A Story of the London Fog, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So basically, Hitchcock takes us on this journey of giving us all the evidence that the Lodger is the Avenger and the killer, and that puts our main female lead in danger because she's a blonde, and so every time she goes out and he goes out, we're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Until we realize, and again, this is spoilers, but until we realize that he's not the Avenger, although the policeman at this point has caught him and found all of this stuff. It's like newspaper clippings from the Avenger and maps of and pinpoints of every place that the murders have taken place. But our lodger says that his sister was actually the first victim, and ever since then he's been trying to, ironically, avenge her on the Avenger.
Yeah, the name is very, very purposeful.
Yeah. And
pre-Marvel, by the way. I just want to throw that out there.
Right. Yeah, it's this kind of thing that's like always in your brain. You're like, I know that has nothing to do with this, but it's so weird. So yeah, at this point, he gets handcuffed by the cop boyfriend, and after he's already developed this relationship with the blonde living in staying in the inn. She's actually the daughter of the innkeepers. And so he gets out, and then the public think that he's the Avenger, and he gets like mobbed in this really tense climax scene. But really the journey is just is he or is he not the Avenger this whole time? And Hitchcock is giving you like all this evidence. Like I knew that he wasn't going into this. And I still was like, is someone else the wrong man here? Because all the signs lead to yes.
Right. And the only thing for me that was preventing me from assuming he was the killer was that I knew it was an Alfred Hitchcock movie. Right. So again, this is one of those things like I wish I could go back to 1927 and just watch this with fresh eyes. Because it's a really, really solid film. It's very exciting. And this is a
silent film. I don't know if we mentioned that. But
yeah. Did we not mention that?
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't remember.
Wow, we really should. It's really, really good. The lead in it, Ivor Novello, has worked with Hitchcock multiple times. He did another silent with Hitchcock called Downhill. And Ivor Novello he was more of a composer than he was an actor. He only kind of did a couple acting gigs, but he composed the music for both The Lodger and Downhill.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's really, really good, really great music.
He also looks like Matt Smith from Doctor Who.
He also kind of does look like Matt Smith from Doctor Who. His hair isn't as swoopy because it's the year 1927.
Right.
It's just they didn't swoop as much then, apparently.
But speaking of Ivor Novello and this idea that Hitchcockian films have this wrong man plot, it's actually interesting to me when I was doing a little bit of research this week that several of the wrong man stories that Hitchcock portrayed in his films didn't start off as wrong man stories, is like including this one where the lodger in the book or the story that this film is adapted from, the lodger is the avenger. He is the killer. And it had to be changed due to censorship and stuff like that. We've talked about that 100 times. But it basically turns into this really interesting and more suspenseful story. It's way more suspenseful that he isn't. And suddenly we become sympathetic to him as soon as we learn his backstory with his sister. And then we're being suspenseful about it. How is he going to get away? How is he going to get out of this and not be charged for something he didn't do than if he just did it and then he gets captured or something like that.
Yeah. It's a nice extra turn in the maze to make the movie more engaging, to make it more complex and interesting, and to make it more sympathetic and emotionally engaging too, which is something really strong in a movie and something that lends it lasting power. It makes you want to come back to it again and again. I've seen all of the movies this week multiple times. So for me at least, it's always enjoyable to come back to it, especially after there's something special about that second watch, because after how he is vindicated, there's something kind of vindicated in watching all these people accuse him. You're like, oh, you're so wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. Just wait. So it kind of gives that nice lasting power to films.
Yeah, and you become upset at those people who are accusing him when the first time through you were accusing him right there with them. So you kind of turn on yourself with that second viewing.
Yeah. And before we get too far into this film, I should bring up the topic of cameos, because Alfred Hitchcock is also famous. He's one of those directors who's not just famous as a director, but his face, literally his profile is famous. And part of the reason why is that he ended up doing cameos in all of his films. And this is where it starts in The Lodger. He had trouble with one of the extras one day not showing up to set, and he needed somebody to be in a newsroom scene where everybody's kind of running around. It's chaos. And he was like, fine, I'll do it. I'm here. And this is the silent film era where nobody has to talk. So okay, we'll just put another body in front of the camera. So he's in that scene in this movie. He's also part of the mob in the end sequence where the lodger is being chased by a mob who is convinced he's the killer, and the rest of our characters know he's not the killer, and they're trying to save him. It's a really great scene, a really great finale, but he is part of the mob. And after this movie, it becomes a thing where he's like, oh, that was fun. Let me try to slip this into each movie. And now there's literally a Wikipedia article, because in every single movie he made, he has a cameo, and you can go to that Wikipedia article and it will tell you the time code to go to in the film where you will see him and what he's doing. And in The Lodger, that's what he's doing on screen. He's kind of hard to recognize because he's much younger. And I think a lot of people know the older Alfred Hitchcock from Alfred Hitchcock Presents, where he's already bald, all the way bald. He's much larger. And in this one, he's kind of chubby. He still has some hair. It's dark, it's black. Not as recognizable, but just to let you know, it's kind of a fun thing to talk about when you're talking about Alfred Hitchcock movies, is where did he slip in his cameo?
Yeah, and he set the precedent for several other directors now who do that. Not just directors who literally will act in their films, but like Peter Jackson, who always does a cameo,
Eating a
and
carrot.
Stuff like that. Eating a carrot, yeah. Or like we talked about with King Kong 2005, when he's one of the bomber planes attacking King Kong at the end of the film. So yeah, but this is a silent film. This is very early film, and we've talked about German Expressionism and stuff like that. And now we see Hitchcock getting his starts here, and we get to see some of the techniques that he's using at the very beginning. So this isn't in Germany, and so we're not having like literal German Expressionism where we're painting shadows and doing huge set pieces and stuff like this. But Alfred Hitchcock is using real shadows and using real elements like fog and stuff to add this texture and this depth and life to these images from cameras that are not very well developed at this point. So it's really hard to get differentiation between your subject and your background and stuff like that. But Hitchcock is doing it masterfully right off the bat. Like we mentioned with the fog and some of the profile shots, like just the close-up shots of people's faces are gorgeous. And it's just everything he's using is really well done, and it carries on throughout his films where even in his later films, like all the way up to Vertigo and especially Psycho, we're seeing him using black and white and using shadows so specifically and to such an effect that you can just use shadows to create an emotion without even showing the object that's portraying the shadow.
Oh yeah. There's a really beautiful close up in this movie that I will always remember. Of so the lodger's just showed up at the house. He's just rented his room. He's turned over all the pictures in his room, and he's looking out the window into the night. And as you learn later, he's thinking about his sister and all the other girls who've been killed by this guy. But it looks like he's either like having a migraine or maybe something much more pleasurable than a migraine, looking out this window. Very interesting expression on his face. But the cross beams of the window form this perfect shape of a cross over his face that goes down the center of his face and across his eyes. And it is just this beautiful, beautiful shot that lends this great depth to the face to make it really pop. And it looks beautiful. And it kind of hints at the wrong man aspect of this character. Like he ends up almost being literally crucified in a way towards the end of the film. And it's just a nice way to work with shadows there. But you also get to see the background of Alfred Hitchcock as an engineer, which is how he became an intertitle designer. The film starts with intertitles that flash almost like a neon sign would flash. Tonight, golden curls. Tonight, golden curls. They come up in that order. Almost like a neon sign flashing. And that's not a neon sign. It's the Avenger, like, fulfilling his weird fantasy of killing blonde, curly-haired women. And whenever you see that, you know somebody's about to be attacked. Something's about to happen. But it's interesting to see that like that's his start in the film and in film industry, and that becomes like a really large technique that he uses.
Yeah, but that's actually interesting because it's a signage for a show, for like a flapper chorus show or something, which it's never like actually shown as that until the very end, when the lodger and the girl are together and they're embracing in his room, and out the window we see tonight golden curls blinking on a building that's out the window. So for the whole film, it's being used as kind of an indication of the golden haired girls that are being killed until the very end, when it becomes, the golden haired girl and the lodger, the wrong man, getting the girl. So there's a really interesting use of that, and Hitchcock is so good at adding in all of that subtext and stuff like that. And the other thing he does is very creative storytelling. And one of the most specific examples of that in this film is at some point, the landlords are downstairs and they're kind of suspecting that the lodger, it might be the Avenger, and their little ceiling fixture is rattling. And so they look up because the lodger is pacing in his room, And, we can't hear that because we're in a silent film. So you can have music portray that a little bit. But what Hitchcock decides to do is he has a shot of from underneath the lodger's feet. He creates literally a glass floor and puts the camera underneath it, and we film his feet. So it looks like we're seeing through the ceiling like an X-ray, watching his feet go back and forth. And it's just so creative and such a great use of storytelling and visual storytelling in a medium where you only have basically half of your ability to tell the story with just visuals and no sound.
Yeah. If you want to learn how to tell a story visually, silent film is your go-to because they have to do it visually. You can lean on intertitles a little bit, but intertitles can get really dense really quick, kind of boring really quick. So everything has to be done visually. So that's why, when the lodger first comes in, he acts like a real creepy person, is because we have to get that unease through that. We have to get our unease visually. That's why in silent films you see exaggerated makeup, like really exaggerated makeup. And you still see it in The Lodger, even though it isn't German Expressionism, so you don't have like big bushy eyebrows or anything, but you still have very heavy makeup so you can see these movements on screen. And if you want to see good shots and good storytelling, just pure visually, like a series of images to tell a story, silent film is your go-to. And you see a lot of the techniques that Alfred Hitchcock learns in his silent film era, like in The Lodger, carry on over into his later films. The best example I can think of is Alfred Hitchcock loves close-ups of weapons or things that could be weapons, because once we see something that could be a weapon in a close-up, we think somebody might be in danger. For instance,
especially if we already suspect the person holding the object of being dangerous.
Yeah. For instance, there's a couple instances in The Lodger. There's one point where the blonde daughter of the landlord family goes upstairs to give the lodger his breakfast, and he picks up a knife, and we see a close-up of him picking the knife, and he's bringing the knife towards her stomach, and then he like flicks a fly off her dress. And we go back to the wide, and we're like, oh, okay, it's okay. But that close-up brings a lot more tension because we see the knife, and we know, because we're going to a close-up, that it's important for whatever reason. And then we learn that, it was a false lead towards the end. And once again, later in the film, the lodger and the girl are playing chess in his room, and we see him bend down to pick up like a fire poker, and he's almost like there's a close-up with the fire poker as he's almost bringing it toward her. And then like we cut away to another scene where the cop friend comes back, but then we cut back to the chess scene, and he's just poking the fire, and it's all good. But we have that nice tension that really interests us. And even if he didn't attack her at these two instances, we get the sense, based on his facial expressions, the cutaways, the elevated significance of those potential weapons, that he is capable of it, that might happen, that might be what we're leading up to. And that becomes the technique that carries over into the rest of Alfred Hitchcock's career. There's a lot of close-ups of knives, of guns, of things that could be dangerous in the rest of his canon. And typically stuff that the other character isn't aware of either. He really likes that dramatic irony where the character is behind the audience in terms of knowledge. So, we know that guy has a knife, but the other character doesn't know that guy has a knife. And that creates a lot of tension in the scene.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking a lot about that with the next two films as far as what Hitchcock reveals to the audience and what he reveals to the characters. So he's constantly playing this game of, do I have the characters ahead of the audience at this point, or do I have the audience ahead of the characters? And he uses it so specifically, and he switches it. He can switch it on a dime to get the exact amount of tension and suspense that he's looking for, because you get a different kind of suspense both ways. If we're on the same page as the protagonist, it's a different kind of suspense than if we're ahead of the protagonist when they're going into danger. So we're going to talk about that with the next two. And speaking of the next two, Alex, let's get into the 39 Steps.
Okay, so the 39 Steps from 1935. So we are now in the sound era of Alfred Hitchcock, but we're still in the British area. We have not yet left for America. So 39 Steps tells the story of a Canadian guy named Richard Hannay, who is in London at the start of the film. One night he goes to a variety show to see a man who knows a lot of facts. He's got like an infallible memory, so he can memorize a lot of things, and he answers all the questions of the audience. Anyway, there's chaos at the show. There's gunshots heard, and Richard Hannay is squeezed out with the crowd as they all file out onto the streets. And he runs into this strange woman who seems to want to go home with him. So he agrees to take her home with him. And once home,
that was a little forward, but you roll with it.
Oh yeah, it's very forward. But I mean, he's down with it. So they're going back. But not much happens. Like, he cooks her some fish. But she also acts very oddly once they get back to his place. She doesn't want to be seen by the windows. She wants to be in shadow. She's worried somebody might overhear them. And eventually she explains that she is a secret agent for hire working for the British government, trying to keep a government secret from falling into the hands of a foreign agent. And he's like, okay, sure, if you say so. They go to bed in separate rooms. I should point that out. It's still early British film too. And then he wakes up in the middle of the night to Annabelle Smith coming in to warn him about the 39 steps, the spy ring that is after the secret. And then she collapses onto his bed with a knife in her back. And he's like, oh gosh, they might kill me too. Plus, this looks really incriminating. So he runs away, and he follows the only lead he has, which is that there's a man in Scotland that Annabelle Smith wants to see. So he goes to Scotland in a very fun series of chases where he's evading cops. It very much feels like a romp movie. Like, it doesn't get very dark very often. It's often kind of fun, kind of jokey, in a very Alfred Hitchcock.
Aside from the bit you just mentioned where the woman falls dead with a knife in her back.
Yeah, but even that doesn't feel that dark. Like, not in the same way that the murders feel dark in The Lodger.
Right.
Like it feels tragic more in the way that it launches an adventure than anything else, which is kind of like a very passé, dry way to treat a murder. But if it launches your film, it launches your film.
Yeah, that's actually kind of an interesting way to put it, because, you think about the opening of Raiders. I mean, that's kind of what the guy who steals the little totem from Indy at the beginning of Raiders is. I mean, he dies, but it kicks off the story. In this one, we just have we're not as against her because the other guy had betrayed Indy. So yeah, but it's interesting. So we don't really know that much about her. So, why should we like her?
Right. She's a very mysterious character. We get that she lives in danger all the time. And plus, her death raises the stakes of the film. We're like, okay, people can die. This is a film where people can die. That's part of the rules of the world. And so we kind of move forward with that understanding that his life is in danger. And so he makes his way north. He dodges some police on a train. He spends a night at a sheep herder's house in Scotland and has a little close call there with the cops. And then he finally makes it to the man in Scotland's house, where he finds out the man in Scotland is actually the leader of the spy ring, because his pinky, the top joint of his pinky finger on his one hand, is missing. And so we have this false sense of security for a moment. We think everything's going to be fine, and then suddenly it's not. And so he has to run away again. And this time he runs into a political meeting.
This is a great scene.
It's a great scene. He's not supposed to speak at this meeting. He's just a complete stranger, but the people of the meeting assume he is. So he has to get up there and
with a handcuff dangling off of his wrist.
Yeah, he's literally handcuffed on one wrist, which is something I want to get into here in a little bit. But he he has to give this impassioned speech because a lady shows up, a lady he met on the train earlier and who readily gave him up to the cops. I wouldn't say unfairly either, because he was a wanted criminal, and plus to try to escape, he like busted into her train car and just started kissing her. And
she doesn't act like the swooning maiden that we see in a lot of other like Cary Grant movies and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, she's like, who the hell are you? Why are you trying to kiss me? Cops, if you're looking for the bad guy, this is probably him. And so he has to run away again. That's a great scene. But he runs into her again. She shows up at this political speech while he's up there starting to get his speech going, trying to get out of giving it. But when he sees her, he knows she's going to go get the cops. And so she starts to go through that process. So he realizes he has to give a really impassioned speech, and he gets the whole crowd riled up and going. He has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't even know the political candidate's name. He calls him McCrocodile. And so he's got the crowd all riled up, and he tries to get out of it, backs up, does get caught by the cops. But when he's caught by the cops, very importantly, he tries to get out of it by telling this lady who's been trying to reveal his identity and get him caught by the cops that the 39 steps are after him. And so the cops, I know this is a podcast, but there's air quotes there, are like, okay, we have to get rid of both of them now. And so they handcuff them together, and we get into like the final chase sequence of the film where they run away from the not really cops who are part of the spy ring. They make it back to London, where they try to find our final bad guy and reveal him to the cops, all while being chased by the actual cops and the not really cops but spy ring cops. As you see, it can get complicated. But it all builds into a very satisfying finale where everything is revealed. All these plots, the best of Alfred Hitchcock's plots, work like a very complicated knot, like a very complicated knotted ribbon that you can pull one thread on and the whole thing straightens out. And then at the very end, somebody will pull that thread and it'll all fall into place. And it's very satisfying because it keeps that mystery going throughout the entire film. And then you get a nice cathartic ending when everything is explained at the end very simply. Like when you look back on it, you're like, that wasn't really complicated, but it felt complicated going through it. And that's what made it interesting.
Yeah. And I think one of the most important parts of your summary is the idea that this is a fun movie. Like, yes, it is a spy thriller, but this week, our focus really is on these movies that Hitchcock puts a little bit of a lighter tone on, even the Lodger, even though it's darker, but because we're going to talk about in a couple other weeks these protagonists that are much more conflicted. But here we have characters who find themselves accused of something that they didn't do, and yet, especially in the 39 Steps and North by Northwest, which have a lot of parallels that we'll talk about, but the protagonists don't seem terribly concerned. Like, they want to get everything straightened out. They want to clear up the confusion. But along the way, they're like making jokes, and they're kind of like literally this film, especially as soon as he gets handcuffed to the blonde woman, it felt like it happened one night, like a normal screwball comedy, except in this film, the stakes are you could die and not just you won't marry the prince that you wanted to marry. So it's this really interesting way that Hitchcock blends a light tone and a dark circumstance into a really enjoyable, still suspenseful, but definitely fun film for everyone.
Yeah, it's almost a lark. It's almost not serious. But I think the key is it starts off with a murder. And we kind of almost discovered that talking through the plot. But, having it start off with a murder sets the stakes really high. Like we said, like we know, our main character might be killed. We also kind of know he won't because it's still early films. Like, this is 1935. He probably won't die unless he's morally corrupt. That's always the trick.
Right.
But we get the sense that's part of the fun of watching a film is putting yourself in that sense of disbelief, suspension of disbelief, where oh, something might happen to our character that that ends his life, ruins his life, something of that sort. And the big threat in this movie doesn't even seem to be that our main character might die. It would be that he goes away for this murder, or as it slowly becomes over the course of the film, that that the secret might be stolen. Like, that seems really important to our characters. Even though the guy's Canadian, not British.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know. I've always been confused on the connection between Canada and Britain. I know they're technically separate countries, but they have the same queen. It's very confusing. Anyway.
But this idea of the secret is something we need to talk about, because we have mentioned MacGuffins before, but now that we're talking about Alfred Hitchcock, we must get into MacGuffins.
The master of the MacGuffins.
Right. The inventor or coiner of MacGuffin.
The MacGuffiner of MacGuffins.
As a refresher, MacGuffin is a term that Hitchcock coined to describe anything that the characters are very concerned about, but the audience could not care less about. So the plans for whatever the heck it is, I think whenever we learn the plans, it's something about making an engine that that goes silently. And we don't care. We don't care why they need that. This is like right before World War II, so there's a lot of war stuff going on. But really, it's just something to make the characters all go crazy and kill people and run away and stuff like that. So that is something that is really heavily relied upon here in the 39 Steps, and will be relied upon again in North by Northwest and several other of Hitchcock's films. But it's a thing that you can understand why the characters care about it, but it really has no impact on the audience. So the plans, we get it, like, that's important. They're going to war. They're going to need that. They don't want the enemy to have that. So it sets things in motion, but that's about it. And we've talked about on the podcast good and bad uses of MacGuffins. So this is like a reasonable MacGuffin that you can understand even if you don't care. Whereas if you talk about things like our old friend King Kong 76, where you have oil as your MacGuffin, like no one cares. And no one cares. No one understands why anyone else would care. So if you're going to use a MacGuffin, make it understandable that the characters, make it actually interesting that the characters are going after this. It's interesting that the characters are trying to not have this espionage plot go through. It's not interesting that characters want to mine a new island for oil.
Yeah. It's almost like the reason for the MacGuffin is important. It needs to be important, but the details of the MacGuffin don't matter.
Right.
So we get why secrets of a plane would be important. Like, we get that. The details of the plane are not important. We don't give a crap. Like, I don't care how the engine works. It's not important to the plot either, but it is. And that part isn't even important to the characters. It's just the fact that it's a secret. The stakes have to be understandable to the characters, in proportion to the actions they take for them. So in this one, everything they do is doubly motivated by the secret and the fact that there's a murder charge hanging over his head. It's the only way he can vindicate himself. Whereas in King Kong, you run into this wall where you're like, nobody would be like, let's face a bunch of monsters for oil. No one would do that. Like, no. And it doesn't work within the context of the film. In this film, it does. And so it functions.
So, okay. So aside from MacGuffins, we've got that cleared up, because that is going to be a vocab word that will be throughout this entire series. So write that down, memorize it. It will be on the test. But moving on to the wrong man aspect, we've already talked about in this film, we know that Hene is the wrong man from the beginning. As soon as a woman walks into his room with a knife in her back and suddenly starts showing up in the tabloids that this woman was in a man's flat and she ended up being killed, so he must have done it. We know he didn't do it, so that puts us on the same page as the protagonist in this film, whereas in The Lodger, we were behind until the very end. But there's also this fun little like wrong man within a wrong man plot in this film, where he goes to this little Scottish farmer's place, and the farmer is like super jealous of his wife and super suspicious of her. And when they're eating dinner, because the Hene needs a place to stay, and the lodger just assumes that Hene is sleeping with his wife, and he gets really upset, and he is kind of an impetus for him to give him up to the cops. But Hitchcock makes this little, like, the scene is not very long, but it's a little like wrong man within a wrong man plot, where the wife like clearly wants something other than her husband, even though they're not doing anything, and the husband is just so like jealous and angry that he just assumes. So it's just, he has this little fun dynamic in this tiny scene within this bigger espionage thriller story.
Yeah. And I want to talk about a couple little things that kind of constitute this idea that we'll be working towards the finale of the series, called the Hitchcock touch, that make him a master filmmaker, that make him one of the best of the best. And it's these little things that just drive the movie, make it interesting, make it engaging. And one of those is on display in the opening sequence of this film, where we don't see our protagonist for like the first 5 or 6 shots. We see suggestions of the protagonist. So we see a guy buying a ticket, but we only see his hands. We see the ticket. We see footsteps going into a theater. We see a bunch of people in a crowd, but even when people start talking, and even when the protagonist's face is on screen, we're not sure he's the protagonist until he speaks. And so for like the first minute of the film, there's not even a question that's relevant to the plot. There's just a question of like, who's our character? We can tell we have a character because it's the same pair of shoes we see, but who's our character? So you have a question going into the scene.
And even really until he bumps into her when they're all leaving, because he's asking this question and he's often like outshouted by everyone else, asking these questions of the guy with all the facts in his mind. So we're like, I don't know, is he just like another guy, or he's a little bit highlighted, but you can't even be totally sure until we go back to his apartment.
Yeah. So we have this driving mystery. And that's something that will happen in the best Hitchcock scenes, regardless of whether or not that mystery is super relevant to the plot. And I do want to point out that even this is important to the story. It's important to know who our protagonist is for the story. But in terms of the plot, like with the whole spy thing and the false murder, like it doesn't matter. But it does make the scene really engaging, and that's what makes scenes good. It's what makes them interesting. And that's just a great example in that one sequence. And it happens throughout this whole movie. It happens throughout all of Hitchcock's canon. So if you're going to watch Hitchcock, if you're going to study Hitchcock, be on the lookout for stuff like that and understand how he does it, what he shows, what he doesn't show, to create interest in a shot, in a scene, in a character. And another thing that I really like, especially in the 39 Steps, I think it's a really great example of it, is that there's this really this great repeated false sense of security. There's like 4 or 5 points over the course of the film where a character like breathes a sigh of relief and is like, okay, I've made it now. Okay, I'm good. So there's almost like these mini cathartic moments over the course of the film where tension is released. And then suddenly we find out that sense of security our character felt is wrong.
Hitchcock kind of pulls the rug out from under you as soon as you felt like you were on solid ground.
Yeah, which builds that tension right back up. For instance, when he finally gets to the Scotsman's house in North Scotland, who he thinks is a good guy. He thinks he's a guy who's going to help him protect the secret and help get him out from this murder charge. And they even hide him from the cops. When the cops come by, he's like, oh, okay, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm safe. And then suddenly it turns out that he is the bad guy. He is like the big bad guy. And it's this really great turn. Turns are always something that will make a scene interesting. But it's also important to pace your tension well over the course of a movie. And tension's kind of like the key word of Alfred Hitchcock films. He's the master of suspense, right? Well, you can't have suspense for literally every single second of the movie, or the characters or the audience will be exhausted by the end. No one can go through that. You can't literally be on the edge of your seat for the entire film, or it will exhaust you. You need those little moments where you can release the tension a little bit, and then suddenly you find out that you have to go back to being tense. As part of that turn, those little turns make it engaging. They make it fun. They make it watchable. Because it's not just monotonal. It's got multiple tones on it.
And I think that another thing that they do is every time Hitchcock does that, he weakens our trust in himself as like the storyteller. So basically, every time that we get the rug pulled out from under us, we're a little bit more on edge the next time we come up to what we think is a comfortable spot, which gives him even more of a hold, because now he knows that we're not sure what to think about this situation because we've already had it taken away from us before. So he's just, again, the master manipulator of audience expectations, and he knows exactly what an audience is thinking at every single point in his film, and he knows how to just blindside us with something out of nowhere.
Yeah. And again, watch out for that. Look for that in his movies as you watch them. If you're interested in studying him, either for the stuff you want to make, or it's just something you're interested in, you're just a cinephile, you enjoy looking for that stuff and understanding how good films are made, because it's present in all of his movies. It's even present in The Lodger. I mentioned those scenes where we think the lodger is about to attack the young girl, and we get all this tension with the close-up, and we're like, oh, he's getting close to her with a knife. Oh, he's getting close to her with this fire poker. And then we come back and realize he was doing something totally innocent. You have, again, that buildup of tension, quick little release, buildup of tension, quick little release. And it's that little buildup, release, that gets steadily larger over the course of the film until you get to that climactic big buildup of tension that's been building over the entire film, big release, as typically in these wrong man plots, our man is proven innocent, that make a film really enjoyable, and that make Alfred Hitchcock's films in particular stunning masterpieces.
Yeah, because it's not just segregated to these early films. He uses it throughout his whole career.
All right, and before we move on, it might have slipped my mind a bit, but let's talk about the cameo in this film, because there is one. It's very early in the film, and you'll notice that Hitchcock tends to put his stuff early on purpose. But his cameo is after that initial chaos in the theater, the gunshots, Richard Hannay runs out and he meets this strange woman. Well, when they're about to get on the bus, there's a man in the background who's tossing a white cigarette box, which will show up really strongly on the black and white film. And that man tossing the cigarette box is Alfred Hitchcock. Just putting it in there real quick at the beginning of his film so it doesn't get in the way of the rest of the film.
All right, so moving on to our final film, North by Northwest from 1959. This film is basically what I consider Hitchcock's ultimate wrong man film, because within the first 5 minutes of the film, we are introduced to Cary Grant's character, Roger Thornhill, who is some marketing executive. It really doesn't matter. But he's going to a meeting at this hotel in New York.
Actually, you know what, Jonathan? I would say what he does for a living does matter. In this one, he's like an advertising executive. And I just noticed and this must have been my second or third rewatch of the film. But one of the reasons that nobody believes this character in particular is that he seems to be like a compulsive liar.
I did notice that line
he does
at
it
the
professionally, beginning. And like everybody he knows is like, oh yeah, sure. Like, and not just in the fact that what he's saying is unbelievable, but in the way that this seems like something that's happened before with this character. Like his mom is like, oh yeah, sure you did.
Yeah, especially with the excuse of him being drunk all the time. You can imagine that he probably has had some incidents similar to that. But we will get there, because first what happens is he raises his hand at the wrong time.
Such a simple mistake.
I know it is. It's such a simple mechanic, but basically the porter at the hotel is calling for a name, Mr. Kaplan, and Cary Grant raises his hand to get his attention for something else. But these two shady men on the other side of the room say, "Oh, hey, that must be Kaplan." And they kidnap him. And this is all within 5 or 10 minutes of the movie. So we have been introduced to a character. We know he's a marketing executive. He has a line, like you were talking about, Alex, that says, it's not lying, it's exaggerating to an effect or something like that, which does become kind of a thematic deal. So he gets taken to this house, and basically they think that he's a spy and he knows information. He's trying to tell them that he doesn't know anything. They're like, aha, you're very good at your, innocent man routine. But he really is innocent, of course. And they end up loading him up with liquor and sending him in a car to drive off a cliff. He comes to his senses just enough to not drive off of a cliff, and basically gets taken in by police for drunk driving. And this whole series, I don't want to go through all the plot points because there is so much packed into this movie, but he gets wrapped up into this international espionage thing. It becomes a wrong man where he ends up having to pretend to be the man that he was wrongfully accused of being. There's a wrong woman plot thrown in there. And it is just such a masterful use of misdirection, of revealing information, of this assuming things about a person and then having that not actually be the case. And it culminates everything that Hitchcock has used as far as these wrong man stories into this one film. And as far as the cameo, just to kick it off, because that's how the film kicks off, right after the title crawl, when it says directed by Alfred Hitchcock, Hitchcock is there trying to get onto a bus, but he just misses it and he looks dejected. And that is one of the things, like you said last time, Alex, is that Hitchcock started, once these cameos started becoming a thing and people were looking for them, he would put them earlier and earlier in the film so that people could focus on the movie itself and not be looking at all the extras trying to figure out which one is Alfred Hitchcock. So this one starts with literally the first frame after the titles and is him. And so the rest of the movie we can just enjoy Cary Grant trying to get out of the situation he's in.
Yeah. And not just early either, but very noticeable.
He's prominent.
It wasn't snuck in. It was, here it is. Please notice this so we can move on. Because at this point, this is, 1959? Yeah. At this point, Alfred Hitchcock is pretty famous. He's actually a well-known director. He's one of those first directors who became very well known, especially once he had his own TV show as kind of a local household name.
He's one of the directors that the French looked to when they were creating the auteur theory. He is the auteur before auteurs. Yeah.
He's a big influence on the mid-century 50s, 60s, post-World War II new waves of the world. Which is funny because a lot of people like to look at those waves and say that they're a rejection of the past, when in a lot of ways they're just a reinterpretation of the past that loves the past. So I don't know. Anyway, not to get too much into film history, but there's that. I also want to point out real quick that the identity that Roger Thornhill, our Cary Grant character, is mistaken for is a secret agent, and secret agents are another form of notorious liars.
Right.
So we have our Cary Grant characters, both, it ends up being both Roger Thornhill and George Kaplan, as he kind of embraces the identity he's mistaken for in order to put it behind him, which is a very interesting kind of little theme twist there. But both of them, a secret agent and an advertising executive, are notoriously hard to believe personalities. So everybody he runs into and he's trying to tell the truth to won't believe him just on the face of who he is or who they assume he is. So when he first runs into the bad guy, Van Damme, and he's trying to explain away his situation, they're like, "Oh yeah, sure, you're not. You're just putting on another fake identity, aren't you, secret agent? Wink, wink." When in reality he is telling the truth, but it's just one of those things that make him really hard to believe and really hard to get through, in a way that's very similar to the handcuffs in the 39 Steps. It's something that is constantly, metaphorically, literally handcuffing our protagonist and making everything they do that much harder, and adding that little bit of tension, that little bit of drama, that little bit of conflict and interest to every single scene we get into.
Yeah. And I think that it's really interesting in this film, like kind of the parallels to the 39 Steps and his other Wrong Man stories, and then how he just elevates it and adds on to it and just shows how much he's grown. There's so many similarities to the 39 Steps, the run-in with the woman on the train, with the blonde woman, which in this story, he runs in with a blonde woman and she accepts him, and they kind of have this fling on the train until we learn that she's working with the bad guys. So instead of him subverting our expectations in the 39 Steps, where she just immediately gives him up to the police, now we've got this whole other dynamic where she's accepting him, but only in order to later betray him because she's working with the bad guys.
And I know a lot of people like to look at some of the some of the less good Hitchcock films, as I should put it, and say they're dry runs for later films. And the one I would say is, if anything, is a dry run for North by Northwest. Saboteur is a dry run for North by Northwest. It's a man accused of being a secret agent, threatened by a anti-American secret society, who has to travel across the country handcuffed to a woman and ends up dangling off of the Statue of Liberty. And that's kind of like halfway between the 39 Steps and North by Northwest. And that has elements where, like, you're handcuffed to a woman who believes that you are the bad guy, and in other ways where it's connected to North by Northwest, like you have to travel across the country and work against an anti-American spy ring or saboteur ring, or whatever they are specifically, and then you end up dangling off of a national monument at the end of the movie.
Right.
And it's interesting that they go different directions. In Saboteur, they go from LA to New York, and they go north by northeast, you could say, and in North by Northwest, well, they go north by northwest. They go from New York to Chicago to Mount Rushmore. But there is those interesting connections, and I don't know if it's intentional. It might be. It might be Alfred Hitchcock decided to go to bat with the same kind of plot again and again until he got it right. In which case, like, bravo, it worked really well. Good for you. Or it might be that he's just so fascinated with the same themes that he ended up making very similar movies. And he got very good at expressing those themes through movies, until those movies got really, really good, as they did North by Northwest. Also, Saboteur kind of felt like a propaganda film, and it came out in 1941. It was anti-fascist. So it kind of felt like maybe he might have repurposed an older plot he did to make a propaganda film. I'm not accusing him of that, but it is a possibility.
Yeah, but with North by Northwest, like you were saying, he kind of returns to this theme that he had hashed out several times in his past and done successfully, with the Wrong Man theme. It's much lighter than some of his other work, returning to, again, like a 39 Steps, almost screwball comedy, but this one, there's definitely more stakes. There's more attempts on Cary Grant's life and stuff like that. But it definitely feels like he's in his element. Hitchcock is just kind of using his craft to its full potential, and he knows how to do it, and he knows how to just complex plots on complex plots. And it's also interesting, the placement of this film in his canon. This film comes out right after Vertigo and right before Psycho, two of his darkest and most psychologically complex stories, and just how much kind of fun you have watching Cary Grant. Like, even though there are stakes and stuff, it's still like Cary Grant just brings a levity to this character as far as trying to figure out what's going on. and it's a lot of fun to watch. And so you kind of get this sense that Hitchcock was taking a break from some of his much more weighty films to just do something really well and have a lot of fun with it. And we haven't even talked about the wrong woman plot inside of the wrong man plot in North by Northwest.
Yeah. Our female lead, played by Eve Marie Saint, who is wonderful in this film, is like a double agent in a way, but unintentionally. Mm-hmm. Essentially, her backstory, to dive into it. And again,
spoilers again for the whole
spoiler alert for you, but I think it's interesting to examine this wrong woman plot. Is she was just a girl at a party who got hit on by this very suave guy, and this suave guy ended up being essentially like a Bond villain.
International smuggler of secrets and stuff.
And she didn't know until the FBI or CIA. They don't really explain exactly who it is. They remain a little coy about that.
We're all part of that same alphabet soup.
Yeah, that's the line. And again, hey, look, it's a little mystery. They're not specifically saying who it is, which makes it a little more interesting, right? Like, rather than just being like, oh, it's CIA, it's like, it's somewhere in there. You probably wouldn't have heard of it.
Which also seemed a little sketchy for me since I've been watching through Wormwood. So I have this little, mistrust of all these government agents right now.
Yeah. So essentially, Jonathan is podcasting at the moment wearing a tinfoil hat. I know you can't see it because this is a podcast format, but just imagine it on his head.
And every time I go to a hotel, I put bars on the windows just in case.
Oh, gosh. Okay, fun. But yes, anyway, Eve Marie Saint's character is a girl who gets involved with this bad guy. She doesn't know he's a bad guy. Mysterious government agency approaches her and is like, hey, your boyfriend is an awful person. Here's all this proof. And she's like, oh my gosh, yes, he is awful. And then they essentially recruit her as an agent. So she's working as an agent for the government at the same time as she's pretending to work as an agent for this guy. So again, she's just an innocent girl who got wrapped up in something way over her head. As that Alfred Hitchcock quote said, my heroes are the average man, or in this case, woman, to whom bizarre things happen rather than the reverse.
But I think the idea of the wrong woman in her case is from Cary Grant's perspective, where he has her. Yeah, when he has her pegged as the bad guy, and after they were flirting and they have a fling, and then he finds out that she was double-crossing him the whole time. But she was only double-crossing him not to give her own double-cross away. It becomes very convoluted, but then Cary Grant figures out that he had her pegged for the wrong woman, while he has to take on the persona of the man that he is wrongfully accused of being, which we can be more specific about now that we're talking about some spoilers of this film, because essentially Kaplan, whom the bad guys think that Cary Grant is, does not exist, and aforementioned mysterious government agency basically created him to lead them, all the bad guys, on this wild goose chase until they finally have a face to put to the wild goose. And then the mysterious government agency comes to Cary Grant and they're like, so can you just keep being this guy that you're not so that we can catch these guys? So the wrong man becomes the right man, which is really no one at all. And the right man, wrong man, finds the right woman, but thinks she's the wrong woman. It is so complicated, but so perfectly Hitchcockian.
Yeah, but it also, like looking back on it and trying to explain to somebody else is really hard. But as you watch it, you get it. You're not confused by the end of the movie. Like, you understand what happened, and that just is a sign of really well delivered exposition. Part of that is the order in which it is delivered, to one, make it interesting and keep a mystery ahead of the characters and ahead of the audience, and two, kind of like the whole no muss, no fuss aspect of the plot. Like, and this kind of almost ties in with the MacGuffin aspect of it. Like, we don't need to know the name of the government agency. We don't need to know the specific information this bad guy is trying to smuggle out of the country. That stuff doesn't matter. We just need to know that it's important. And that makes the plot much, much easier to understand and also very engaging at the same time. Like, it's easier to follow. Whereas if somebody had tried to dive into like a really detailed world where like this information explains this and this is the specific government agency, like you're just tying yourself into knots there that you don't need to tie yourself into, and that can easily bog down a plot. And sometimes that works, but it doesn't always. And the way Alfred Hitchcock pulls it off with a no muss, no fuss, mysteriously delivered plot functions just so well.
But there is some information that we do need to know, and when Hitchcock reveals that to us, is so interesting to track throughout this film, because there are so many twists, like the fact that when he's taken to the bad guy's house, and then all of a sudden it's not the bad guy's house, it's just where he was holing up, and then when we're finding out that she is working with the bad guys, Hitchcock, first of all, puts us on the same page as Cary Grant when we meet her in the train. And then after they're starting their romance, we transition and we see the bad guys are in the train too, and he gets a note from her that says, "What do I do with him in the morning?" Suddenly, we are ahead of Cary Grant, and now we're like, oh my gosh, he's like literally in the arms of the bad guy right now. What's going to happen? And so then we're on the page of Cary Grant, but we're not fully caught up because we don't know that she's actually working with the bad guys yet, until much later. And then also we have this whole Kaplan thing, and we are following Cary Grant trying to figure out who Kaplan is, and we want to know who Kaplan is too, until Hitchcock just randomly throws in this scene of 6 people that we've never seen before, and they're like, so how is he going to find Kaplan if Kaplan doesn't exist? And we're like, what? Kaplan doesn't exist? And, Hitchcock is constantly like letting us get like inch ahead of the character until the character catches up with us. And then he shows us a little bit more. So we're like, oh my gosh, what's the character going to do, until we're on the same page with the character again. And he just does it like perfectly. He knows when and how to do this again, which is why he has the title, The Master of Suspense. Yeah.
And I think a point we should really drive home on this episode is that that talent, that ability to build suspense, build tension, and then release it, control information, delivery, to show, don't tell, imply, don't show, is something that doesn't just apply to suspense action thrillers or murder mysteries, which was Hitchcock's preferred genre. It's something that applies to all movie making, whether you're telling like, a sci-fi movie or a courtroom drama or like a teenage romance movie or all that sort of stuff. Every movie is at its foundation a mystery. You're in a sense revealing information to the audience in a certain order, in a certain way. And the way in which you reveal that, the order in which you reveal that, how you choose to reveal that is what makes a story or a movie, more precisely, either really engaging or really stupid.
And as a quick, specific example, if we want to throw way back to early in season 1 when we covered Pride and Prejudice, you're even seeing the same things in Pride and Prejudice, where you're learning different things about Darcy, which changes your perception of him as you go, and you're learning. So you're mostly on the same page with Elizabeth, but it's still that revealing of information changes what the audience is perceiving and how they perceive interactions of characters based on what they know about those characters in relationship to what the characters know about each other, if that makes sense. So it applies to all genres. It's just really applicable in these suspense movies because, that's literally what they hinge on. And if you don't get it right, your audience is not going to like it.
Yeah. And I do want to talk about something I mentioned just a minute ago. Show, don't tell, imply, don't show. Normally you hear it as show, don't tell. But we've kind of gotten to the point where we say imply, don't show on this podcast because it's really good. And it involves showing, but it also involves implying. And it's something that you see in a lot of Hitchcock films is what you don't see. You don't see a lot of murder, which sounds weird because there's a lot of murder, but you don't see a lot of graphic violence. Like even the famous shower scene in Psycho isn't as graphic as people remember it as being, because he doesn't show the nitty gritty details. He shows just enough to tell you how horrifying it is, and then your mind fills in the blank. A great example at the start of North by Northwest is when he's cornered by our bad guys in his very first encounter with them. Cary Grant is set up to do his whole drunk driving thing where they forced feed him or forced make him drink, however you'd say it. Like an entire bottle of bourbon, like a whole pint of bourbon, and then to get behind a wheel of a car, they were going to push him off a cliff and make it look like a drunk accident. But instead of like showing him drinking, being forced to drink the bourbon, which would have been graphic, but not very suspenseful or interesting, they have the bad guys pin him down, and then in front of his face, they start pouring this glass of bourbon for him, and it just keeps going up and up and up until the whole thing is full, and then they cut. And you know what's going to happen, and you get how scary it is, because that's what's scary for the character in the moment. Drinking it is awful, but that moment of suspense leading up to it, that drum roll up to the cymbal crash of seeing that bourbon being poured and knowing what's about to happen is terrifying. And they imply the horror of what's about to happen, but they don't show it to you. And something about that is just so much more, maybe not necessarily satisfying, but interesting and mysterious and engaging to the way you tell a story.
Yeah, because no one wants to see Cary Grant just like choke on bourbon being poured down his throat. That's not very attractive.
And I think that's something we've lost, or at least some people have lost since we've moved past the era of censorship. I'm not saying censorship is a good thing, but the censorship rules forced filmmakers to go to this place where they had to imply stuff. They had to imply when two characters have sex. They have to imply when a character gets drunk, because you couldn't show somebody getting drunk on scene. You had to shoot people being killed in a very interesting way, because you can't have the person doing the shooting and the person being shot in the same frame. You have to separate them out. So it forced this kind of atmosphere of creativity. Yeah, that you lose when you get to this point where you're like, okay, we can show the graphic stuff now, and they show it because that sounds more intense, because they can. But that thought that has to go into it of like, how do we engage the audience and make them part of the process? Because that's what engaging the audience means. It means making the audience do part of the work for themselves, which doesn't sound very intuitive, but it really makes sense, because if you watch a movie and everything is handed to you on silver platter, it's kind of boring, right? Like, yeah, you have to work for it, and that's what creates the suspense, the tension, the interest in movies that you get from, the joy of implication, the ability to imply, don't show in your films.
Yeah, I wonder how much that conversation happens in studio and writer rooms and stuff like that, where it's just what if we didn't show this? What can we not show to make it more interesting? And if you guys have examples,
guarantee it doesn't happen in studio rooms,
right? But if you guys have examples of good uses of not showing something, because there's so many examples of just graphic shock, horror and violence and stuff like that. But if you guys have good examples of when that is concealed in order to make a more effective moment, shoot it to us, send it to us on Twitter, because I would love to see that in more modern films.
Yeah, and before we move on, I do want to touch on one of the more fun aspects of the film, and it's kind of like this visual motif of just grid lines, literally just grid lines. The opening credits kind of start playing over a set of grid lines that fade into the windows on a skyscraper. And there's grid lines throughout the film, whether they be buildings or train tracks, or even the fields when Cary Grant is being run down by a plane in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, that kind of permeate throughout the movie. And that happens in another Hitchcock movie too. Spellbound has a lot has a lot to do with parallel lines. They play a very big part in that movie too. But it's just an interesting little visual motif that happens throughout North by Northwest.
Yeah, and if you're bringing up the intro titles, we have to at least mention Saul Bass, who created the title sequences for this film and Psycho and Vertigo, and was just an amazing title designer in this era of film history. And we kind of start with this green and blue, these lines that then fade into a building, and he uses the perspective of the building to fly the titles in and out. I always love watching Saul Bass titles and stuff like that, so that's really interesting.
Okay, so let's move on to overall notes.
Yeah, so there are several things like throughout these, and again, we've been talking about these, but when to tell the audience and how much you need to tell them. So, if it's details about your MacGuffin, you probably don't need to tell them everything. Keep it vague in the audience's mind, just enough that we know that people care about it. Because if we know too much about something that we don't know about, then we start to just wonder, like, is that a real thing? Like, is that...
Yeah, so the audience will nitpick it apart. Like, they'll go internet on it and be like, that makes no sense. But if you keep it vague, they can't really argue with it.
And they're not thinking about it. They're thinking about what's going on. As long as you give them enough that they understand why the characters would need to go after this or care about this.
Yeah.
And then it's revealing important piece of information and or concealing important piece of information and then revealing it at very specific times in order to make sure that you know where your audience is. You don't want your audience to guess something before you've told it to them. And Hitchcock is perfect at doing this. We've talked about Twilight Zone before, and some of those episodes work even though you can figure it out because you go into it kind of looking for the ending. But with Hitchcock, he will often just tell you so before you can guess what it is. But then after he's revealed that information, he makes you wonder about the consequences of what he just told you. So it's just, again, that you don't have to always show everything, and then picking very specific times of when to show important piece of information.
Yeah. And also this idea of keeping the mystery going, because every film is at its base moment at its base a mystery film in some way, because we're wondering how it's going to end. So you have to keep the audience guessing, like you were saying, Jonathan. And to that extent, the climactic moment in a lot of Hitchcock films, and in basically all of the films that we covered today, is this moment of vindication that makes the wrong man plot click and work. Is that the central question of the story is, will this person be vindicated? Will they get away with it? Or not get away with it because they didn't do anything wrong, but will they get out of this situation? Will they stop being the wrong man, and can they go back to their life? And it's that moment of vindication that typically ends up being the climax. The 39 Steps is probably the best example, because that is literally the climax of the movie. They catch the bad guy, and they reveal that the hero is not the murderer. But, that's the key point to making the theme for this week work, is that the big moment of the film, the end moment of the film, is that the wrong man is revealed to not be the man.
Right. And we're seeing in North by Northwest and throughout all the films where we talked about over these next 4 more episodes, is that Hitchcock had these actors and these people that he would work with over and over again that he really liked, as we've talked about with many, many directors. Probably most of the directors that we've covered have a pet cast and pet crew. But 2 of them are Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, which we saw Cary Grant in North by Northwest. Jimmy Stewart was in 4 other Hitchcock films, and Jimmy Stewart was actually slated to star in North by Northwest. And one story goes that I read is that Alfred Hitchcock thought that Vertigo didn't do very well when it was first released because Jimmy Stewart looked too old. And so he cast Cary Grant instead, when in fact Cary Grant is actually 4 years older than Jimmy Stewart. and they both look pretty old anyway. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. They are both great, but I think Cary Grant really pulls North by Northwest off in a unique way, and it's a role that we've seen him play before. It's very similar to his Arsenic and Old Lace and Bringing Up Baby role, except it's not as bumbling as those roles are. It's much more grounded, but it's a similar situation where he's just kind of thrown into something and trying to figure out what's going on around him in this chaos.
Yeah, and originally in another Hitchcock movie that we're going to end up talking about, Rope, Cary Grant was originally supposed to be the professor character, and it ended up being Jimmy Stewart because there was a conflict of scheduling, and Jimmy Stewart ended up in the role. And now looking back on it, both Rope and North by Northwest are so iconic as part of Alfred Hitchcock's canon that it's hard to imagine those roles reversed. They're both phenomenal actors, but each has their own little nuances that make them a film star, and bring a little their specific touch to every single role.
Yeah, absolutely. And those films have become not only like part of Hitchcock's canon, but they're part of Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant's canon. Like when you think Cary Grant, one of the first movies you think of is North by Northwest. So, I mean, I think for whatever reason, like the casting worked out well for both of those films.
Yeah. It's typically like a weird jumbled path to making a film, with a lot of compromise and weird choices made. And then the ones that end up working, you're never really sure how they work. It's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. And sometimes it works and some people are really good at it. And Alfred Hitchcock is one of those. And again, one of those touches that make Alfred Hitchcock one of the best, and something I touched on a little earlier, is this idea, and it becomes very literal in the 39 Steps, but it works as a metaphor in all of his other movies, of handcuffing your hero in a certain way. Something that, all heroes are supposed to have faults, but there's something special about throwing another roadblock in their way. And in the 39 Steps, it's literally a pair of handcuffs that that he has to keep hiding. Our hero has to keep hiding as he walks through the streets, as he runs away, that he has to try to break out of once he's tied to, or literally handcuffed to, this woman who hates him, and thinks that he's the bad guy. And it's just this extra little roadblock that makes every scene more interesting. Like, take away the handcuffs in 39 Steps and you still have an interesting movie, but you don't have a masterpiece of a movie. At least I don't think so. I think it's just one of those things that elevates the tension a little bit more in the film and makes it more fun to watch. Yeah,
and speaking of handcuffs, that goes into a point that I kind of wanted to bring up. Just taking a step back, there's a pretty famous story that Alfred Hitchcock has told, that maybe that people have kind of speculated is the reason that he has such a fascination with this wrong man idea, this idea of the ordinary man who is accused of doing something heinous that he never did. And the story is that when he was a child, he did something, something dumb, something like young boys do or whatever. And his father, to teach him a lesson, took him to the local police station, and they locked him up there. I don't remember if it was for a couple hours or overnight or something, but he told him, this is what happens to naughty boys. And it terrified Hitchcock so much that maybe just kind of like stuck in his psyche, and is like he's constantly trying to get vindication for the man who's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like we saw literally in North by Northwest, when literally just raising your hand at the wrong time can involve you in international affairs and lots of top secret government things. All right, and finally, a thread through all three of these films, and also through every single Hitchcock film, is his portrayal of women, and specifically blondes, and also mothers play an interesting role, like we saw in North by Northwest. I don't know how much we touched on it, but Cary Grant's mom comes in and basically just blows off everything he has to say for a while. But yes, in The Avenger, we have this killer who is only going after blondes. In the 39 Steps, our character ends up getting handcuffed to a blonde who gives him up to the police and then doesn't believe him, and then they end up falling in love. And in North by Northwest, same thing. Our wrong woman is a blonde who Cary Grant ends up realizing is not the woman he thought he was, and they fall in love. So next week we are going to get into the women of Hitchcock films and talk about 3 movies, although we could pick probably any of them, but that feature women prominently that we can talk about. And that's going to be Spellbound from 1945, The Birds from 1963, and Marnie from 1964.
Right. It should be very interesting to talk about a lot of those from Alfred Hitchcock's prime years. They should be very interesting to look at. Salvador Dali was the art consultant, production designer, I'm not sure which, on Spellbound, and he has some interesting influence on that film, so it'll be really interesting to talk about. But we also have to mention that we have to say next time instead of next week, because we'll be doing things a little differently this year on the Filmlings. Instead of an episode every week, we are going to be doing an episode every other week. And there's a few different reasons for that. A little bit because we just want a little more time to think about each episode, partially because we want to work on some other projects that we have going on. But we will still be around. We will still be putting out Filmlings episodes. And, nothing's permanent. We're not saying we're going to do one episode every other week forever, but we're going to try it this year, and we are going to see how it goes. We hope it leads to higher quality episodes. And if you have feedback on the new scheduling or the quality of the episodes, please feel free to tweet at us, and we will be saying our Twitter handles and our current outro very shortly. But another thing before we go, if you have a friend who is interested in film, who is a cinephile, a family member who you think might like a particular episode or a particular filmmaker, feel free to reach out. Shoot them the Filmlings. Make us your free plug of the week, as we like to freely plug other things. We don't do this for attention. We do it because we like it. But we also like engaging with our audience whenever possible. And that means having an active and engaged audience whenever possible. And the more people who get a chance to listen to the Filmlings podcast and enjoy it, then the better. And I hope all of you guys enjoy it. And I hope you can find somebody else in your life who might enjoy it as well. And thank you guys so much for listening. It's been a wonderful first year, and I'm very excited to do the second year of the Filmlings now.
We've got lots of stuff lined up. Hopefully this new schedule will give us more time to do our research, watch movies that relate, that we can bring into the conversation, and hopefully it'll give you guys time to listen through these episodes and stay up to date. We know that they are a little bit lengthier than your average podcast, 30 to 45 minutes. So again, give us feedback, what you think. And if there's someone, we've done this for a year now and we're not going away, we're going to keep it going. So we feel pretty confident that this is going to be a very consistent thing. So share it, get it out there. And even if it's just like, oh, hey, I saw that movie, just give it a listen, send it to somebody. And we would definitely appreciate it so that hopefully we can get everyone thinking about films more. And the more that the audience, the general audience of film, is being critical and intellectual about the films that we're watching, hopefully that, like, in some small way, that trickles out and just raises the quality of film in general over time. I think that's the only way that that's going to happen, and that is part of the goal of this podcast. So spread the word. Spread your thoughts, send them to us, talk about films with people, and that's what we're here for.
Mm-hmm. And as always, make sure you rate us on iTunes. That does a lot to get us into people's suggested feeds on iTunes pages out there. So the more ratings, the better. But that is about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We really do appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
Sorry. Oh, gosh. Sorry.
You okay?
Yeah, just a sneeze tease.
The dreaded sneeze tease.
Dun dun dun. Put that on a shirt.